Carlton King is a former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
Hello, welcome to the Black Spy podcast. My name is Carlton King, and as you know, we tend to do is shine a light on the hitherto extremely enclosed world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, and the connected geopolitics that go with this secret area. The aim of the podcast, as it always is, to inform and hopefully entertain. And today, I've got an absolutely excellent guest on the show from the United States, a US Army colonel, retired, who has been closely connected with the secret world in many ways. And she will explain that to you. But the beauty of it is, as I've just said, she is a she, and she's also Black. So we're going to look at the perspective, how that has worked through the United States, because she's very interested in one particular area, which is 6888, and she will explain that to you in the course of our discussion. So without further ado, what I'm going to ask Colonel Cummings to do is just give me a feel what it was like and how she could break into this world in the United States from the time and period when she was born, and how that sort of happened, and what maybe the trials and tribulations were, or maybe not. So, Colonel Cummings, Edna, if I can say so, can you give us a quick hold?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to your show. This is exciting. I never thought that I would be able to share my story on such a platform as yours with the background information that you provided. So again, thank you. First of all, I was born on a military installation. So to your point about how I became involved in the military and I guess the world of secret operations, I was born into it. I was originally from Fayetteville, North Carolina. My father was stationed at Fort Bragg as part of the 82nd Airborne. So I tell everyone I joined the family business. We would frequently go to various locations, 2 tours at Vietnam, and sometimes he was not able to share with us everything that he did. So we were taught early on some things you just don't talk about when it comes to the military, nor do you pry. It was so interesting. His first assignment in Vietnam was part of the advisory group, and he was wounded horribly, almost died. But he mentioned that they could not share exactly where they were or what they were doing in Vietnam. And we thought that odd because he was wounded carrying out the mission at the time in Vietnam, but couldn't really talk about it. So that was the beginning. When the Army allowed women to participate in the Army ROTC programs to become an officer, I decided that's what I wanted to do. I'd been so impressed by the military, the discipline. We lived on military bases. And there was a young lady in our neighborhood who was a member of the Women's Army Corps. And she would invite me to various events. She even had me model as a young child in some of her fashion shows with the USO. I had another friend who worked at the military exchanges. Those are the shopping centers at Fort Bragg. And in the summers from college, she would always invite me to work. And I worked in the special operations post-exchange. So I was introduced to the military at a very early age. I mentioned it's just part of the very fiber of my existence. When I graduated from college, my first assignment was at Fort Rucker, Alabama, the home of Army Aviation. And then I had an assignment in Korea, very close to DMZ. And at the time, the young man I was dating had the job of protecting the DMZ. He met with the North Koreans on a regular basis. So many times when I went up there, I just had to be still, stay in one room for 7 or 8 hours. So when you're young and in love, that's what you do. You can sit in a room for 7 to 8 hours without freedom of movement around the installation. And I thought about your question, and that's really how I became involved in the world of classified operations. I think between my father and stationed in Korea, very close to DMZ, and visiting Panmunjom was early introduction. And I actually got out of the military for a while and then came back in. And when I came back in 1989, I stayed in the reserves. I didn't totally get out of the military. I stayed in the reserves for a while. And I came back in the military in 89. And right afterwards, Desert Storm started. And my assignment was to work in the Pentagon's Army Operations Center. And we did that. The war didn't last that long, but it was just so intense and just helping the military, the Army, figure out who is doing what to whom at the time, deploying forces and just listening and understanding that there are some things that once you leave the Army Operations Center, you cannot discuss. So that was my introduction early on. And after the Desert Storm, I just continued the operations because even though the war is over, there's always events going on throughout the world that requires the military's attention. So even though Desert Storm was over, was no longer in the operations center, I continued to work, various programs, not all classified. And I had the opportunity to teach leadership, Army ROTC, the Reserves Officer Training Corps classes at Georgetown University. I did that for a while. And that was in the mid-90s. And in the mid-90s, there were some rumblings about things going on in the homeland. And at the time, Homeland Defense, Homeland Security was not a primary mission area for the military. We organized at the time, and it's changed a little bit, but fundamentally the same. You organize by combatant commands that are focused on certain critical areas throughout the world. And there was not a combatant command for the United States. And I'll address that a little bit more later because that impacted our structure afterwards for 9/11. So after Georgetown, I went to an assignment I was part of the Response Task Force East at First Army. It was in Georgia at the time. And our mission was to train the first responders and enhance civil-military interoperability. The title of my position was a military support to civil authorities, because within the United States, the military does not lead disaster response, regardless whether it's man-made or natural. Along the all hazards model, the military has a support function. So we were working with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency in our region, regions 1 through 5. There are 10 FEMA regions, regions 1 through 5. We were helping FEMA to work with the military, understanding when to contact the military for support. So I was a military support to civil authorities officer. It's changed now. I think it's called defense support to civil authorities, but this was back in the mid-90s. Again, pre-9/11. So the military had started to ramp up to respond to all hazards, including domestic terrorism, because I believe Oklahoma City bombings had occurred and just some other homeland, meaning the U.S., other events that required the military's attention. And the military realized they could not continue to respond the way that they had in the past and be effective.
You mentioned it. There was the Oklahoma bombing. There are also some attacks in the United States, primarily in Washington and in other places, which related to the actions that you were having then down in South America and Central America. Definitely at the time of Reagan and then post-Reagan and through until the end of the Cold War. So up until that end of the Cold War stage, were you then, as the military, not having any interaction in CONUS, the continental United States, at all? Or were you having slight interaction, but not at any scale?
Since I was not a part of that particular effort, I can address in the 90s when I became involved in the mid-90s, but I believe the actions and activities that you are speaking about inform the response or the developing of capability to respond, and that continued to evolve. So after a couple of years at Fort Gillem, I then came back to the Pentagon to work in an office called Consequence Management Program Integration Office. And what we did, we stood up weapons of mass destruction civil support teams. And these are National Guard teams throughout the United States to be the tip of the military spear to help the first responders and the civilian community respond to all hazards, to include acts of terrorism. So this was in the late 90s by the time I went back to the Pentagon, pre-9/11. And so we formed these teams, WMDCSTs, that are still active today and have been very useful in helping the nation to respond. Their National Guard teams. And of course, during that time, 9/11 happened. Our office stood down after we formed the initial 10 teams. And a lot of time again in the Pentagon Operations Center, my office was actually in the basement of the Pentagon.
Just going to ask you,
Yes.
attack on the technical, if you were sitting in the building at the time, maybe like that.
Yeah. And it was interesting. 9/11, our office, we had completed standing up the 10 teams or very close. And we had started transitioning those functions to throughout the Department of Defense to institutionalize the response because, again, we called them operations other than war. Domestic terrorism was not a primary mission area for the military. It was very important, but it's not primary. It was part of this, they call it SOLIC at the time, Special Operations, Low Intensity, Asymmetric Warfare. So we worked a lot with those communities. And so our office stood down. It was 2001, maybe in August, and we were still transitioning. And to give you an idea of how fresh the transition was, on 9/11, my secretary that I had, our office secretary, had moved to the Pentagon. And I had to go to my neighbor's funeral who had died. Her father died. And my daughter convinced me to go to this funeral. And so on 9/11, I had planned to go to the Pentagon, one of the offices that was hit pretty hard. And everybody in the office had been wiped out, but I was at a funeral. And the lady who I was supposed to meet, my former secretary, wasn't even there. I didn't know it at the time. She was actually in Florida. So that was my 9/11 experience. I like to tell people that my daughter saved my life. And I was there. And the thing about it, after 9/11, 9/12, I was back in the basement of the Pentagon, standing up the Emergency Operations Center again to help with the 9/11 response. So after 9/11, again, the military, you probably know this, throughout the world, such a significant impact, realized that we had to develop capabilities within the homeland to address these ongoing acts of terrorism. So after the Pentagon, my next assignment was at NORAD, Northcom NORAD. I was part of that transition team to stand up the Homeland Defense Command for the United States. So in a nutshell, you heard my military career, and it's interesting that your podcast focuses on so many of the things that I worked with in that environment in the classified area, because we had been standing up capabilities since the mid-90s within my area of responsibility in the military to address a 9/11 type of event.
A couple of things came off that to me straight away. One was through the work that I've done in the past. And by the way, I should go all the way back to you. I worked for what you're calling the Postal Exchange, which is AFES, Army Naval Exchange Service. I worked for AFES way back in the 70s. I just happened to be in Germany, and that's actually got me started on this whole thing because my boss at the time in AFES was an ex-FBI special agent from the counterintelligence section of the FBI. And he had worked with Special Branch Scotland Yard on the Yard's course. And he was the one who said to me, taking camp in Germany, if I were an Englishman, I'd be in the Special Branch. I'm trying to do the American accent, but it's not that good. So I got started because I was basically an exchange detective and I was doing all these on 5 bases, which they had there. And it seemed strange. These were pretty much strong level investigations because it's just not that long after Vietnam. A lot of the US military, too many indeed, had succumbed to the plague of narcotics in the field, and subsequently, basically, they were selling the rations, whatever that might be it cigarettes or stoners or cars. They were selling them for narcotics and selling the narcotics. Or there was a drug suppression team there with the Army CID and the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, so it's a lot of work with them and various things like that. So my initial coming into the game is via the US military, albeit I was never a member, just in the DOD via that. So that was interesting to me.
Yeah, right. It was called Smoke Bomb Hill, and that's where the Special Operations Community shop. It was a small exchange, one of the satellite at Smoke Bomb Hill for the Special Operations at Fort Bragg.
But prick my ears straight away. We jump forward now to basically before 9/11. Now, some of the work I was doing in the UK, and we had army interoperability in the UK military interoperability in the UK for a long time because of the problem we had with Irish republicanism. And then the problem we had in the other side, Irish, what we call loyalism. So that's two sides of the same bite of the same coin, if you will. If you remember, back in 1922, the Irish Free State was born, which is now the Republic of Ireland, and the North was kept by the UK. Some would say, if you were a Republican, that it's the United Kingdom's longest colony. And so you had Northern Ireland, which was created by itself. And so what was inevitably going to happen, and it did, was that you had a battle led for some wanting to be part of the Republic and others wanting to stay part of the United Kingdom. And that split down on religious lines in one way, but also just Irish Republican lines on another way. And there was also a mixture, an element of socialism involved in it as well, from one side to the other. And obviously some connection with the Cold War era where anybody who was against anybody else was anybody else's friend. Yeah. So it was in Afghanistan, same as in Myanmar for the Soviets, and connected. So interconnectability all the time. So I was always working with military when things were interconnected, particularly in the branch. We were doing that in the homeland. So we were ahead of you. Now, what I did notice, and the reason why I said all of that, was that it seemed that some of your military special forces in particular were drawn towards right-wing extremism, to what you might now call white nationalism, and were training people in that particular area. And if I'd speak with the FBI or whatever, because at one stage I worked on the American section in Special Branch, and my liaisons were with all the American forces and obviously federal agencies. And we'd be getting this idea that there was a problem with right-wing white supremacy, and unfortunately bought by some of your special forces. Did you have any recollection of that?
Within the military, there probably, as you all know, the military is a microcosm of society.
Absolutely.
Everyone does not serve. And the extremism, yes, there was some bleedovers, but in particular areas that I worked in, I had one assignment as an equal opportunity program manager. This was in the 90s. We did address those issues. And so now I'm not as involved. I'm aware of it. But our current Secretary of Defense, General Lloyd Austin, is a fantastic individual. And I'm sure that he is doing everything to address those issues of extremism. I mean, everyone saw the January 6th Capitol Police. I don't know if any of those individuals were in the military. May have been some, but those lines between the extremism and the military, I know that the Secretary of Defense and his staff are just very adamant about a zero tolerance, for that type of behavior in the military. Again, I personally did not have any experience with those extreme attitudes. When I came in the Army, it was a time for groundbreaking for African Americans, minorities, all minorities, women. I experienced more gender discrimination more than racial discrimination, which was interesting. People are surprised when I say that, because the Army, we had and all the service had separate branches for women. And you had these women back in the late 70s or mid 70s coming into the military. Women have always been part of the armed forces, but it's separate and not equal. And so a struggle for equality for women has been the larger issue, because that's something that a lot of the men could agree on, regardless of their race, when white males, black males, or whomever. It was not anti-women, but it was such an anomaly. And what do we do with these women? I remember looking on some of my evaluation reports a few months ago, clearing out old files, and someone had written, "We must take care of this lady." And I'm like, I appreciate the fact that I am recognized as a lady, but I am also an officer and a soldier. So please refer to me in that context when writing whatever about me. So the gender issue for me was, I experienced some discrimination, because of my race, but the gender by far in the military for me was the larger issue.
I guess people are saying, can she do what men do? I guess that's the overriding perspective. Was that what you got, or was it dressed up differently?
Oh, absolutely. Because after college, when I had to select my specialty, it was so limited. So there were only a few areas, branches, as we call them, that I could select: administrative, logistics, and what we call at the time was combat service support. then gradually more skills became open. And now it's just great to see women at the service academies and special operations school, the ranger school. So a lot more combat opportunities have been opened up for women to serve. And I just think it's such a shift from when I came in. We compartmentalized so much until we had to steer clear of anything combat related. We could be attached because now my first assignment at Fort Rucker, it was the Army Aviation, and it was so frustrating, which kind of led me to what I'm doing now with the World War II women.
That's what I want to hear about later on.
Yes, I went to this assignment, a petroleum company had to refuel the aircraft. We had teams to refuel, tactical refueling for the flight school. But I didn't have any training in that field before I went to warehousing and operations. And since, it was logistics, I was a warm body, but I was assigned to a combat engineer battalion. So here I am. I was an anomaly. I was a Black female, a second lieutenant at the lowest level, totally clueless about what I was supposed to do. But fortunately, similar to the organization I'm advocating for, the 6888, I did have some great mentors, some white males. I never forget this West Point colonel who was the brigade commander, Doc Bonson. He was an armor guy, and I was so nervous. He reminded me of General Patton. Right. So you think here, a Black female, 21-year-old, straight out of college, with this Patton-like figure.
Yeah.
When he approached me, you talking about shivering him in my boots, but he was the most supportive individual on that installation. And I always said he provided me top cover while I was there. And to this day, I don't know where he is, but I cannot thank him enough for his support. So the point being, you are the only one, regardless of what that only is. You just hope that there is someone there who supports you to mentor you, coach you. And then I learned it was on the job training, and the military gives you leadership skills to look for inconsistencies. You may not know what's right, but you sure taught to understand what's wrong. Policy and regulation, says A, B, C, and D, and whatever is going on the operations side does not follow the policy. You can challenge that. And that was my introduction to the military, just understanding the policy and guidance and leadership structure and knowing what buttons to push if you believe that something is not correct.
Absolutely. What you say is right. At the end of the day, you can't treat everybody with the same brush. And what I found when I worked for you guys in AFES was a kind of a standoffishness between the different races. So you'd have Blacks who tended to be together, whites who tended to be together, and actually that broke down even more so because you had guys who tended to be Southerners who tended to often work together, and cowboys, strangely, seemed to kind of work together, Westerners, some of them. And then you had Hispanics who would be together. And the strange thing was that I could work and move between all groups because each group used to give me a different title. So one group would say, oh, he's a Black guy, so he's all right. Another group would say, oh, he's an Englishman, so he's good. Well, I'm sure he's some sort of West Indian, so he must be okay. They're sort of Hispanic. I can remember moving between the people, but everybody being comfortable by saying, you're part of my group. But it was clear to me that the military was way ahead of civil society there in the United States. Because I could see your TV because you were watching AFN or whatever, and what's American Forces Network. And you could see what was going on in the States and voting right problems still. All this is like in the 70s, but there's still that going on, particularly in the South. An unwillingness, as you can see, still today, less so willingness to give up aspects of the past. First mayors voted in, and sometimes that being problematic for Black men, it's being voted in. And you could see this on US television, but the military seemed to function. You had, indeed, I think General Powell was in Wiesbaden, and then later he'd become chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So it's an anomaly, the US. It's kind of, I don't know how you would describe it, but it's the sort of country where in some ways you say, oh, this is strange, but in other ways there is progression. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I know by living on military installations and growing up in the military community, we are forced together and focus on the mission. Because when you're on the battlefield in training or whatever, You want that talent.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in. That wasn't always the case, which is why I'm looking at my timings. We're going to come to AAA and we're going to come to the whole segregation of the US military. Because again, when I was working with Avies, I can remember a guy whom I knew, he was an ex-Air Force guy. He married a German woman and he was in the Red Tails. Okay. So who don't know, that's black pilots who basically supported bombers going over and bombing Germany.
Right. Tuskegee Airmen.
Tuskegee Airmen, correct, in the Second World War. And it took the president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, to actually get this off the ground, because otherwise it was never going to happen. This guy had been shot down for Germany, which is why he's still learning he married a German woman. And what he said to me was something that I've never forgot. He said, my plane was shot, I knew I was coming down, and I'd, heard all the tales about Germany. So I checked for my pistol where it was, and I thought, this is me finished. And I landed on a parachute. I was slightly injured, and the Germans were already waiting for me, and I was there. And this officer came, and he saluted him and said, he saw his rank. He said, Lieutenant, war's finished for you. And that was the first time a white man, a white officer, had ever saluted.
Oh, wow.
Now, you've kind of got a problem there. You're fighting in a force, in a unit, fighting for freedom of your country, supposedly. And he said, we'd go into places, bars, whatever, where white officers were, and you knew there's a battle there. In fact, most of the times we couldn't go in because the MPs would say white soldiers night or whatever, and you couldn't go in, or you're not allowed in there, it's off limits. And so you had that discourse of fighting for your land, the people you're fighting with not respecting you. Now, I'm pretty sure there was some white officers and white men who wanted to respect you. The lady sky often is the one who people bend to or kneel to. And I'm guessing that, amongst the people who probably didn't think anything of this black guy coming in, the fact that somebody was mailing off, 9 times out of 10, it's probably a Southern officer in that sense, but at that era, I guess the others didn't want to say anything. And so, indeed, what he said is we always just acted together. That's it. End of story. We just acted together. By we, he means black people in the US military. So I come to 888 from looking at timings, and you've got an experience of that in 888 in the Second World War as it relates to females. Could you explain to the listeners what that is? And then I slightly want to touch on, before we leave, Black Lives Matter. So if I can come to that first, that'd be great.
Sure. The 6888, the 688th Central Postal Directory Battalion, was a group of 855 women hand-selected from the Women's Army Corps during World War II. During World War II, what a lot of people did not know, that there were more than 6,000 Black women in the military during World War II. You never see them in the media. You never see anything in documentaries or historical representations of World War II about Black women. You see the Moffett Marines, Tuskegee Airmen, and other Black units, but never saw anything about the 6888. When I became aware of this organization, I worked with the 9th and 10th Horse Cavalry Buffalo Soldier Committee, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to erect a monument.
For those who don't know, Buffalo Soldiers were Black soldiers in the US Civil War, and indeed afterwards, who basically fought a lot of the Indian wars in the West, and then subsequently went on to fight in Spanish-American wars. Black soldiers, you never hear of them, but they were a large part of the US military.
Right. And Buffalo Soldiers, everyone, these units were finally getting recognized for their contributions. So I worked with that committee to erect a 6888 monument, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Afterwards, a documentary producer, James Ferris, had done some work about women from World War I who were not recognized as veterans until years later. He saw similarities. He asked me to help him produce a documentary. Another female Army veteran, Master Sergeant Elizabeth Held Frazier, and I worked with the James Ferris to produce the 6888 documentary. And also, he suggested that we introduce Congressional Gold Medal for this unit. The Congressional Gold Medal is the highest civilian award in the nation. The Moffett Marines, the Marines who served in World War II and afterwards have a Congressional Gold Medal. The Red Tails Tuskegee Airmen have a Congressional Gold Medal. The 6888 did not. And what the 6888 did, when they went to Europe, there was a massive backlog of mail because of the World War II Battle of the Bulge and fast movement of the troops. The mail could not catch up. And so morale was low. The troops were losing their will to fight. And the Army, who runs the mail operations, basically said, hey, we got to do something. And with no training in postal operations, without knowing what the mission was, you had almost 1,000 Black women, 855, to go to Europe. They landed in Glasgow, Scotland it's a 9-day journey, I believe, chased by German U-boats.
Absolutely.
So we had women in a combat situation early on in World War II, but you never hear about. So when they landed, V-bombs, or buzz bombs as they were called, exploded, causing them to run for cover. And when the women reported to the King Edward School in Birmingham, England, after 9 days at sea, they had to march. And just like a passing review for the general at the time. And the commander of the unit was a 26-year-old Charity Adams Early. Again, no training in postal operations, but devised a highly efficient system processing 65,000 pieces of mail per shift, 195,000 pieces of mail per day to clear the mail backlog. Birmingham, England was the worst of the mail backlog. They did it in 3 months. The Army thought it would take 6 months. So you have Black women exceeding what other units had failed to clear this backlog of mail to restore the troop morale. And the accomplishments of this unit have not been recognized at the level that our team thought it should be. So that's why I'm pushing so hard for the Congressional Gold Medal. It has passed the Senate twice, actually, and we are awaiting action in the House. We have about 80 co-sponsors, which equates to votes short of the 290 needed in the House of Representatives. We have 2/3 of the votes from the Senate and the House. So we got the Senate, so now we are working on the House, and hopefully we will have that accomplished by Veterans Day.
Okay, so you don't see resistance there at all?
No, we don't see resistance. It's more education than opposition. There's so much going on in the United States right now with the Congress, and it's about that constant outreach and having conversations with these various congressional offices in the House of Representatives. And I don't have opposition. It's the education process, because with thousands and thousands of bills to be considered, I just think it's great that we've come as far as we have.
Absolutely. And you've been a main player in this, so let's not underplay your position.
Yeah, I'm the citizen advocate.
You've been the main player in it, so that's fantastic. I'm just so conscious of time. We're going to have you back, that's for sure. If you come back, of course.
Sure.
Well, anybody listening who has any influence whatsoever in the US Congress, I'm sure you've done all your homework and pushed it so far anyway, but anybody listening who could aid and assist, let's make sure we get that medal, which is well deserved. Just one last thing I want to say is the Black Lives Matter issue, which, and the reason why I'm asking you this is because you having stood up the military's connection with the civil power, as we would call it. The former President Trump spoke a lot about Antifa, which we know in the UK forever and a day. So it's nothing new. And him saying that movement had been hijacked by Antifa. What I would suggest that movement is not hijacked by Antifa, but when it comes to street action, that movement can be hijacked from both sides of the extremist sphere. So by those who are Marxist orientated like Antifa often are, or if not Marxist, syndicalist, even not politically minded at all in many ways. So you've got that aspect. And then on the other side, you've got the right wing who also have hijacked that movement to cause as much trouble and strife as possible, because if you read the literature now coming out, and it's been that way for 10, 15 years, if not longer, from the US, it's about making or starting a race war whilst the white supremacists in the US are still powerful enough before they're overtaken, if you will, by the non-white races. Those have been opportunities. I noticed that the ex-president never spoke about that issue. So what I wanted to ask just before we finish is, have you seen that? Have you understood that in any of your roles?
What is so interesting about the advocacy with the 6888, the World War II African-American women who served, by the way, to the expats who's listening, the bill number is HR 1012, House of Representatives Bill 1012. I have a Twitter page at 6888. I look at my followers and I get followers from both sides. It's not a lot, but it surprises me that something about the military and veterans issues, even the extremists agree. that this is the right thing to do, because I tell our team that these women are not just Black women. It's more than about being a Black woman. It's about the accomplishments. How as African Americans and as women, we have to go above and beyond and do far much more for sometimes half the respect or no respect. And so the 6888, that story, there's so much more I can share with you. Just so many connections with the commander. Her name happened to be Edna. It was Charity Edna Adams. And she had an advocate when she arrived to Europe. I had an advocate when I arrived to Fort Rupp, Alabama. I didn't have the training in petroleum operations. She didn't have the training in mail operations, but we did have leadership training and support. And throughout my military career, I was just amazed at some of the white males that I've spoken with who actually came back and apologized for giving me a hard time. They says, all right, you are a damn good officer, and we really apologize for giving you a hard time. The exact same thing happened with Charity Adams. She was in the military. She gained advocates and support, not because she was a Black woman, because she was a good officer.
Capable. Yeah. And this is what I'm saying to you. It's this, the loudest guy speaks and the other people don't really want to say anything, but they're not all the same. And on that, did you ever think of using the role model, if you will, for want of a better word, of Soviet women? Soviet women fought unbelievably hard in all units. Soviet women, in fact, Ludmila, I forget her surname, was the greatest Soviet sniper, men or women. Did you ever use that element to say, we can perform the role?
Well, I know when I was in the military, we did look, I recall when I was working women's issues, we did look at women's roles in the military throughout the world as some examples, because other countries were ahead of the U.S. in terms of integrating women into the armed forces. And speaking of the Soviets, with the 6888, I actually did a virtual presentation with the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, because they were impressed by the work of the 6888. So not the Soviet women, particularly as a whole. When I was on active duty, we did look at how women were integrated in the military in other countries.
If you ever get a chance to look up the Soviet women and their combat activities, I'm talking combat now, be that as pilots, be it as snipers, be it as special pioneers, be it as whatever. These people were in every aspect of the Soviet doing exactly the same and dying like flies, of course. Yeah, because you're looking at 40 million people dying, 20 odd million military, so dying like flies. But yeah, sorry, Edna, I've got to come to an end. We've kind of overrun a little bit because you're so interested. I'd love to have you back. All what I would say to my listeners is, if you want to hear absolutely fantastic information and gain knowledge and an overview of how men, women, mates, whatever, come back to the podcast. We've got people like Edna who are going to give you that feel. So the best thing to do is basically to subscribe. As I said, it's free of charge. Edna, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. This was exciting. I enjoyed it. Appreciate your time.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to come back to you because we're going to have you on again because you've got so much I know that you didn't even touch on, and we'll do it again sometime in the near future. For our listeners, thank you very much and see you next week.
Carlton King is a real-life working-class spy, bringing you the details, the stories, and secrets from his life spent spying. Give us a 5-star rating on Apple iTunes, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss any of the excitement. This is for your ears only.
My name's Carlton King, and I'm an ex-spy.
This podcast was produced by a podcast company. If you need help with your podcast, simply visit apodcastcompany.com or email Jason at apodcastcompany.com.